We have a new world number 2 as Arjun Erigaisi beats a grandmaster to overtake the likes of Fabiano Caruana and Hikaru Nakamura in the live rankings with an outstanding rating of 2809, the 14th highest to be ever recorded. He's only now 22 points away from Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT of all chess. Do you think he'll be the first one to overtake Magnus Carlsen in the ratings in a long time? Now let's see the win that got him to this historical rating amount. Let's get straight into the game here. So his opponent here is Amin, and he plays pawn e4, and Arjun over here is playing black, and he plays this opening. He plays pawn e5. Now Arjun's game is opening is nothing to really, scoff at. It's very strong, but it's nothing too out of this world just yet, because it's just a very simple Italian game over here. The two knights defense. Now, you guys are probably scared of playing this variation. I know a lot of beginners like to play bishop c5 because they're scared of the fried liver, but the fried liver isn't really seen at the highest level, because with perfect play, it's an easy draw from black. And so after knight to f6, his opponent decides to play the more positional move, the pawn d3 move, which I also really like. I also like pawn c3. Both these moves are very good, but pawn d3 I like a little bit better because it keeps the position slow and allows white to try to build up his advantage against black, while black has to try to equalize as soon as possible. And so after this, our opponent here, Amin, decided to play bishop to c5 in this position, and white just castles. Okay, very easy development. Again, nothing too special. Like, this is an open that's probably been seen like a billion times at this point. After pawn c3, black plays pawn a6. If white plays pawn b4, which is a setup I really enjoy, I call this the crab because it looks kind of like a crab. The idea is after pawn a6, we just have, bishop goes back to a7. White plays a4, stops b5, from being annoying. We play pawn h6, stopping bishop g5 once we castle. And the opponent plays rook e1. Again, white's game here is to play slowly, but very positionally. Slowly outgrind the opponent, right? We're slowly developing his pieces. Again, one of my favorite playstyles over here from white, while black here is just trying to equalize, slowly make the position one where white has no advantage. And when that happens, black can finally strike out and win the game. So after bishop a7, the opponent plays pawn b4. The pawn storm is heading over to the queen side. And so because of that, Arjun employs something that is pretty smart, actually, and this is something I always recommend beginners do, actually, is that when your opponent is attacking on one side of the board, you don't try to defend there. A lot of people make the mistake where they try to defend with moves like pawn b6 and they just try to hold the onslaught. But chess is inherently not a defensive game. If you ever find yourself just defending, you're probably in a losing position. You always need to get counterplay, right? And so I want you guys to take a second here. I want you guys to think very carefully. If you were playing as black in this position, what move would you guys play in this position to try to get counterplay, to try to get something? And again, this is one of those moves that the engine doesn't necessarily agree or think it's the best move at all. The engine says to just castle and, take the beating that white's about to give you. But Arjun says differently, and he says, I'm not going to take this attack sitting down. I'm going to play pawn g5 immediately. And again, while the engine doesn't like this, this is one of those moves that will scare your opponent, because it looks like the pawns are very close to your king. And yeah, with perfect play, you're going to win the game if you're stockfish. But again, people are just human here, right? People are just human. So when I see g5, I get spooked. Maybe I'll play h3, which is a terrible move. And in this position, white decides to play bishop e3. He's trying to trade off the bishops over here. Now, bishop e3 is not the best move. Like, to be honest, bishop e3 doesn't really do anything. I'm not sure why we want to trade off those bishops over there. The engine here, it recommends rook a2, but a move that I probably would have played is pawn d4. And pawn d4 is just a very simple idea. It might not be the best move, but pawn d4 just says, I want to break out in the center here. My opponent is in a castle, and it doesn't look like he's ever going to castle. And if he does castle on the king side, his king side attack isn't very scary anymore because his rook isn't really in the game. So when I see my opponent doing something like this, I just break out in the center and just say, hey, I'm going to open up the position as much as possible. and maybe your king will be exposed, and then I win the game, and that would be pretty good. And so after pawn d4, it's our would be, our opponent might be forced to capture us. He might be forced to play something like pawn b6. Like, there's a lot of moves here that are going to be very spooky for our opponent. And if he just, plays a bad move, like if he just plays something natural, like bishop e3, well, bishop e3 blunders the e4 pawn. But among other things, it's hard for black to play here because his king is so exposed in the center. And so d4 I think would be pretty good, but bishop e3 was played again. Not the best move in the world, but it is what it is. Bishop takes e3, rook takes e3. This rook isn't really providing the most value here, but is what it is. Pawn g4, knight goes back to e1, and after knight to e1, black just continues with the pawn storm. He says, I don't care about what's going on here, and that is the proper attitude to have here from Arjun, where we're just going to be marching the pawns up, being super spooky. And if white isn't careful here, he will get into a lot of trouble here. I know I would definitely be in a lot of trouble here for white. I would try to go for my queenside attack, and then there would be some random tactics here, and then I just lose the game. Now, eventually, Amin does play pawn d4, which is a good move. It just tries to break out in the center and try to take advantage of the opponent's, exposed king. But it's a little late now because look at where the pawns are. They're like right in front of the white king, and even then the engine still doesn't say that black is winning. But from a human perspective, and that's the important perspective in these positions, if I was playing white here and I'm just looking down at these pawns, I am spooked. And I know a lot of beginners here, they might mess up. They might play a move like h3, maybe even g3 in these positions. But these positions always end up worse the more you move your pawns up because of the weaknesses you expose now. So Amin over here does a good job. He doesn't move the pawns up, which is actually very smart of him, because any pawn move leads to a loss. Instead, he just plays bishop e2. He's coming back. He's playing a little bit defensively now, which, as I've told you guys before, you never want to play defensive chess. Instead of, bishop e2, perhaps something like, knight a3, knight c4 in the future, right? You got to get the pawns up. And in this position, you can't ever play pawn b5 without the threat of, if pawn b5, capture, and you lose your rook, and then you're very, sad in that position. So after bishop e2 in this position, it's black to move, and black decides to just play queen e7. Now, queen e7 doesn't really do much, to be honest, but it might be trying to play queen f8, queen g7. It might be trying to get his queen to the king side, as well as trying to avoid any silly captures and queen traits here, because a kingside attack is probably not going to work if you don't have a queen in that position. And so in this position, white presses forward. He plays pawn to d5, and we just play our knight back to b8. Now, I know a couple of you guys might have played knight to d8, but knight to d8 has no future. You always want to think about your future in these positions, and a knight on b8 has the idea of playing to d7 and maybe knight f8 and g6 and f4, and that's a very incredible outpost for black. And this knight is very happy here compared to like d8 where it's not doing anything at all. So okay, knight to b8, and white finally develops all his pieces. He finally plays knight to d2, and black plays queen f8. He's going for these slow maneuvers that I really do like. I like these slow maneuvers where we slowly inch our pieces to perfect positions, and we're about to see it with all of black's pieces. Now, this move is technically an inaccuracy, but again, it's hard for your opponent to figure out why it's an inaccuracy. The computer recommends a move like pawn c4, and then in this position, if you play something like queen g7, then pawn c5, and all of a sudden, white's attack over here is just so fast. Look at this, knight c4 is coming in, d6 is going to be exposed, and we're not really going to have time to go for our kingside attack, because our opponent does have a lot of defensive options here, while our kingside is kind of underdeveloped, which isn't great. But that's not what happened. After queen to f8 in this position, our opponent plays knight f1. He's in the brain control scenario where he's just scared, right? And I would be scared too. I mean, who wouldn't be scared of all these pawns showing up at your king's door? And so he plays knight f1, and the engine again says that it's completely equal here. And so queen h6 is played. After queen h6, white plays pawn c4. He realizes, better late than never. It might be important to move our pawns up. But in this position, when the opponent's kingside pawns are knocking at your king, while your c pawn, g pawn, b pawn, and a pawn, they're not even close to promotion or winning any material, generally this means it's a position that is comfortable for black, at least, if not just downright winning. Now, After pawn to g3, the opponent captures, Ahmed captures, we capture, and then he plays pawn h3. Obviously, guys, generally in these positions, taking here is positional suicide in these positions. And while there isn't a win right away, like in these positions, your king just being so exposed like this is just asking for trouble in these situations, because there's going to be checkmate very soon. If you're not careful, these checkmates are going to be very, very, very hard for you to avoid. And so in this position, h3 makes sense. You want to close the position as much as possible. You just need to be scared of, h3 becoming a possible target where a bishop can capture, and then all of a sudden things explode, and now he has an extra pawn on g3 in the attack. And while this sacrifice doesn't work, right away, it is something that is you always need to be scared about. And one false slip up and you lose the game. And so black plays knight bd7. He says he wants to stop pawn c5 over here, but in reality his opponent just plays pawn c5 anyways. And okay, we don't really want to take 1,000 different ways, because if you capture and then he captures back, like these positions are not usually very fun for us to play. It's not that fun, because the problem is you have like exposed c files that can be used, and yeah, it's just not very fun to play here, because things are just going to fall apart extremely quickly, and life won't be very good there. So after knight bd7 in this position, after knight to bd7, white plays pawn c5, black plays knight f8. He says, I don't really care about what's going on here. Do your worst, and I'm going to do my worst to you as well. I really like this gameplay where, okay, you do whatever you want here, I do what I want here. And I think my plan is better than you. And so I will win. And that's how you win at the higher levels. At the higher levels, people aren't just blundering pieces anymore. But what they are doing is that they're, wagering a war. They're wagering that their attack is going to be stronger than the opponent. And in these positions, it's whoever has the better mindset, the better plan, who always comes out victorious. Not necessarily what the engine says. So, capture. White is exposing black's queen sign more and more, and he plays queen c1, possibly trying to go to c7. And it's going to look spooky, but by moving the queen here, he gives an opportunity for black to sacrifice on h3. Taking on h3 looks amazing here, and it's very scary, because after g takes h3, we already have mating threats like queen to h1 mate. Like if the opponent isn't careful after we take on h3 in the future, well, this is going to be problematic for the opponent. Now, in this position, after bishop takes h3 and g takes h3, in this position, black doesn't actually take the pawn right away on h3, because the issue with taking this pawn on h3 right away is that your opponent can actually stop the checkmate with moves like bishop f3. And funnily enough, even though it looks scary, with his pieces like in this format, there's no entrance squares for our pieces as black, right? There's no mate. There's really nothing that we can do here to continue. So what black decided to do here is, again, something I really like, and something that you guys should try to employ in your own games, where he just plays knight g6. And he plays knight g6 with the idea, hey, I'm just going to plop a knight here. Like, yeah, you can take this pawn, but I'm going to take on h3 with my knight. And that will cause a lot of disruptions, because it's a check. So after rook to g3, knight to f4, again, our opponent is on the back foot here. His position is scary. Where if he plays something like, queen c7, he's already losing for pretty obvious reasons, to be honest. But take a second and think about it. Well, there's a free bishop, right? And then free rook. And so white doesn't have time to deal with these things. He has to come and defend. And that's what queen e3 does. It defends the bishop, and it also tries to defend the h3 pawn. But not very well, because we still have 3 attackers on it and only 2 defenders. It's not enough. But white's idea is that he's going to give up the exchange, so that in this position, it's not that scary anymore. And this is something that you guys can try to do in your own games. When you guys are scared, and when you guys see that your opponent is coming in with a lot of pieces, you can always sacrifice back material in order to, alleviate the pressure. Make sure nothing spooky happens to you. And so after bishop f3, it looks like white has survived, right? And in reality, he has. There's no more queen. There's no more pawns. His king is open in the endgame, which is actually good for him because his king can come in. And white survived. And according to the engine, this position is equal. But this is where Arjun is able to work his magic in positions where, nobody can ever expect a win. Like this position looks pretty equal. He's able to pull a rabbit out of a hat here. And after bishop f3, rook goes to c8. He has the rook, so he wants to use the open files. White plays rook b1, and he plays rook to c3. In the endgame, the most important things are active pieces and passed pawns. And that's exactly what he's getting here. So knight to d2, and while he gets 2 minor pieces for the rook, which is generally favored for the minor pieces, the black is giving white a very hard time to coordinate. And so after knight to d2, king to e7, and pawn to a5, well, in this position, like what is white's plan here? Like, what is he actually supposed to be trying to do in these positions? Black actually has kind of a stranglehold on white, where his pieces are kind of stuck. Like, you can't move a knight because then you lose your bishop. But if you move your bishop, you let the opponent's rooks just enter the position, just start destroying everything. Like, it's kind of a lose-lose situation here. And black just continues by making his position better by maneuvering his knights to better squares. Perhaps we're going to play b6 next, where if you capture, knight c4, we're getting our pieces to good squares. King goes to f2. In the endgame, the king is a very important piece. It's worth around 5 points of material in the endgame because of how strong it is, how it's able to go to a lot of squares. Now, knight to f8, we're trying to hop our next knight to f4 because the first knight going to f4 was amazing. The opponent's plays pawn b5. He's going for compensation, which makes sense. Knight g6, capture. And in this position, the opponent's bishop goes to g2. Our rook goes to h6. Our opponents we go to rook to h6, and our opponent gives us a little check here. And again, our opponent's pieces are getting active, but because his rook is here, it's not back home defending. And this makes a lot of sense for our opponent here. We play king f8, so our rook can see on d6, and our opponent plays rook b6, and it looks like he's going to win one of our pawns. And while yes, he is going to win one of our pawns, we're not going to just give him the pawn for free. Instead, we're going to get some compensation on the other side of the board to try to win. And again, knight f4 is a very good way of doing that. We defend d6, and all of a sudden, there's a lot of pressure on his pieces. Our opponent just takes the pawn, which, makes sense. It's a free pawn. And then we decide to play rook a3, making sure his rook can't just come here and push the pawn out of the way. Instead, he has to put his rook in front of the pawn, which is never a good thing. Rook a8 check, king to g7, random check. Again, he's just trying to push his pawn, which is what he does. But these pawn pushes, well, it's scary. As long as our rook stays on this a file over here, it's never going to be too big of a problem because we can always just take him if the rook just moves back. So, rook to a2. We're disrupting him here. Now, it's a little tough here, right? Like, what does our opponent play? Like, a lot of very simple moves, like king e3, just loses the game because you just allow your opponent to enter with a move like rook h2. And all of a sudden, the skewer here will make you screwed, right? And because, well, your bishop's under attack, knight's under attack, everything's under attack, you're just going to lose the game there. So, king e3 is terrible, so he needs to, defend properly, and he finds the best defense, which is knight f3. This stops like rook a2, which makes sense, and he also defends his knight at the same time. Our opponent's playing very smart here, and so in order to stop that, and in order to, bring in more pieces to the attack here, black decides to play pawn f5, and this is an amazing pawn break, because the idea is if the opponent just captures us over here, we have pawn e4, and we're disrupting the harmony here, and this is what I really like to use pawns for once all our pieces are into the game, where we just, your knights are defending each other, they're in perfect harmony, but this pawn is going to be like the Fire Nation, right? It's going to come in, disrupt all that harmony, it's going to attack, right? Obviously, if our opponent's silly and he just moves his knight away, like if he plays like knight e4 in this position, like his entire position collapses very quickly because rook takes d2, king to e3, and all of a sudden we just take everything, right, in this position, and our opponent is just lost here because he's just down material, right? And so something like that. And so that's what I really like about pawn f5. But our opponent is smart. He is a GM. He's a lot better than me, right? And he knows how to handle these positions correctly, because I probably would have messed up. He plays rook a7 check. Black plays king f8. He plays rook a8 check. Essentially, by going back and forth here, he's offering a draw. Black plays king g7. And white plays rook a7 check. And do you guys think Arjun accepted the draw in this position? Would you guys accept the draw in this position? Let me know in the comments below. And if you guys are enjoying this video so far, leave a like and perhaps comment. And if you guys enjoy and want to see more Arjun content in the future, press the subscribe button. But after this move on rook a7, to be honest, if I was playing a 2600 rated player, I would accept the draw. I would just go back and forth and be like, well, you got it. Got a draw is black. Call it a day. But in this position, he does not do that. Instead, Arjun decides to play for a win here with king f6. And again, this is just one of those moves that are just fearless. That says, hey, yeah, your pawn's close to promotion. Yes, you do have threats that can be against my king now because my king is so exposed on f6. Like d6 pawn is hanging. A lot of things are hanging in this position. But Arjun has no fear here. He says, I'm going to move my king closer to you. I'm going to get this win. And I'm going to get over 2800. And I am going to become the second highest rated player in the world. And so after king to f6, immediately our opponent, mind controlled, messes up. In this position, he plays bishop to f1. And this move is a complete blunder in this position. Instead, what he should have done was rook to d7, getting that compensation. And at first glance, this move looks like it's complete losing because of rook takes a6. But this move is actually a blunder because after bishop here, this rook is in a lot of trouble. Because if you try to keep defending the pawn, this loses because of knight c4. And all of a sudden, your rook cannot defend. We take d6, we take e5, we take everything. And black is the one that's losing. And so in this position, white decided to play bishop to f1 first, defending the pawn on a6. He wants to play this and then rook d7. But this one tempo is one tempo too slow. And Arjun, like a shark in the water, takes advantage of this right away by taking on e4. Says, I'm going to disrupt the harmony. And in this position, white plays bishop c4, trying to go for an in-between move. But this in-between move doesn't even do anything, because rook c2. And all of a sudden, a lot of things are hanging here. White cannot capture on e4 because of the pin, and even if he could, you would lose the bishop on c4, which is not great. And so after rook to c2, white plays rook d7. He's trying to get that compensation, but again, too little, too late in this position. Rook to h3, and in this position, we're threatening to win the knight because the knight is pinned still. King goes to e3 in this position. E takes f3, free knight, we'll take it. Knight goes to e4, check. We play king to f5, and in this position, he decides to take on d6 with a little check. And we'll move our king to g6 with this very minimal checks left. And after our opponent plays bishop f1 attacking our rook, after our next move, our opponent, Amin, resigns here. So take a second and think for yourself, what would you guys play in this position to win the game? It's not too complicated in this position. However, chess.com, I remember seeing this live, and chess.com said that this was a brilliant move. And in reality, it was a brilliant move because it's cool. It's a pretty cool looking move, to be honest. So take a second, and I'm going to tell you guys the answer now. So if you guys haven't figured it out yourself, pause the video. But the answer is rook e2 check. A brilliant move. Because in this position, the opponent's king can't go anywhere. So it's like checkmate. But the opponent can capture. But after capturing, we just capture back over here. Our opponent has a discover attack against his king. He needs to go backwards, otherwise we just promote and life is good. But it does not matter where he goes. We're going to be able to promote. For example, after this move over here, we can just play rook h2 check. He plays down here. We play rook h1 check. We get the promotion no matter what. Now, if our opponent decides to go the other way, it's even easier now because we don't even need to, risk our rook. We can just play rook d3 check, king here, check here. And it's going to be mate extremely, extremely soon. After king to f3, in this position, rook to d3 check. The opponent plays here, and there's a very simple mate in one, which is just queen g3, queen in the face check, mate. Now, this was an incredible game by Arjun. And it kind of displays why he's climbing so fast compared to so many other players. He takes risks, right? This claim according to the engine, is not perfect. He's not playing with 99% accuracy. But because of that, he's allowing his opponents to take risks and lose the game. He's allowing his opponents to make mistakes. And if you guys want to climb, I think this is a very good playstyle to go for. So I'm going to be covering a lot of Arjun's games in the future. I really do like how he plays. It reminds me of Mikhail Tal again, one of the most exciting chess players of all time. And while it's not my own playstyle, it's something that I can learn from as well. So hopefully we can learn together. If you guys enjoyed this game by Arjun, let me know in the comments below. Let me know if you're excited for a new world number 2, and if you guys think Magnus Carlsen is going to be dethroned very, very soon, as Arjun is close approaching. Alright, see you in the next video. Bye.